Okay, so today I'll be discussing neocolonialism in Latin America. One of the big concepts in Born in Blood and Fire by John Charles Chessin, that's the book we're reading. This was covered in chapter 7. While Latin American nations gained independence in the early 19th century, true self-governance remained out of reach due to foreign economic influence. Instead of direct colonial rule, European and later U.S. powers controlled Latin America through trade, investment, and financial dependence. In the video, I'll explain what neocolonialism is, summarize some key historical events, analyze Chessin's argument, and hopefully connect it to some other themes like hegemony and transculturation. I also have some questions I made for myself to answer, so we'll do that at the end. Neocolonialism refers to the continued dominance of Latin America by foreign powers, primarily Britain and the U.S., through economic rather than political control. While Latin America was technically independent, its economies remained structured around the needs of industrialized nations, leaving them vulnerable to external influence. Unlike colonial rule, where Spain and Portugal exercised direct political authority, neocolonialism functioned through economic pressure, trade dependence, and investment strategies that primarily benefited foreign powers. Latin American economies were largely based on exporting raw materials like coffee, sugar, bananas, and minerals. As we saw Banana Land, the documentary, this was a connection I made right here. I don't remember much about the documentary, but from the clip, it was obviously too much. It's a lot more to go into detail, but I'm just gonna keep going with what I got down. I'm sorry. These goods were in high demand in Europe and the US, but Latin American countries had little control over prices or profits. Foreign investors, especially from Britain, built infrastructure like railroads, ports, and telegraph lines, but these projects were designed to extract resources and not to develop local industries or improve living conditions for the majority. This can also be connected back to chapter 5, I believe. I don't remember, I just said progress chapter, so whichever they talk about progress and they build the railroads and everything to help and all that. Governments in Latin America often welcomed foreign investment, believing it would modernize their countries. However, this meant they became dependent on foreign loans and companies, limiting their ability to make independent economic policies. I've also connected this to more of a progress. Again, I don't remember the chapter, I kind of just write what I remember down. And it was talking about how Brazil had its own path and kind of had their cities more modernized before the rest of Latin America. The benefits of this economic structure were not evenly distributed though. A small elite class descended from colonial landowners profited from foreign trade while most of the population remained impoverished. Indigenous and African Latin American populations had little access to the wealth being generated. Instead, they continued to work in exploitative labor systems, such as debt, peonage, and company-controlled plantations. The economic structure reinforced colonial-era social hierarchies, keeping power concentrated among the wealthy while marginalizing the majority of the population. Chestin argues that neocolonialism was a continuation of colonial exploitation, just under a different system. He shows how foreign business interests dictated national policies and kept Latin American nations in a position of economic subordination. Instead of military rule, economic dependency became the main tool of control. Latin American governments often had to cater to foreign investors to avoid economic collapse, which meant prioritizing exports over local needs. Chestin's main argument presents that neocolonialism is a process that kept Latin America dependent on wealthier nations. While independence movements had broken colonial rule, they hadn't dismantled the systems that made Latin America economically vulnerable. He provides examples of how Latin American governments borrowed large sums of money from European banks, only to fall into debt crises that forced them to comply with foreign demands. He supports his argument by examining economic data, historical case studies, and government policies. He shows how even major political leaders often had little choice but to align with foreign business interests. For example, he discusses how infrastructure development, while seen as progress, was largely controlled by foreign companies, meaning that profits and decision-making power remained in the hands of outsiders. To connect it to the earlier topics, like I mentioned, hegemony, to connect to that, neocolonialism is another form of ideological control. Just as colonial subjects were taught to accept their lower status, neocolonial economic policies made Latin American elites accept foreign dominance as necessary for progress. This belief discouraged efforts to build independent economies. For transculturation, economic dependency also shaped culture, with elites adopting European and American business models and customs, while indigenous and African Latin populations maintained distinct traditions. This cultural blend was another way Latin America remained both connected to and controlled by outside forces. To compare to colonialism, during the Spanish and Portuguese rule, control was enforced through military force and rigid social hierarchies. In the neocolonial era, however, economic mechanisms like foreign investment, debt, and trade dependency replaced direct governance while maintaining the same power dynamics. This shift made it seem like Latin America was independent, but in reality, economic policies were dictated by the interests of Britain and the US. So I came up with two questions to kind of help me think about it more. Could Latin American countries have taken a different path, or was economic dependence inevitable given the global economy? And while I can understand that it could be avoided had they took a different path, I feel like with the way global economy works, from my bits of knowledge, that eventually they would have had to, depend for economic help. Sorry, I can't word that well, but it could have been a different system, if that makes sense, or a different context, like different countries, bigger countries, smaller countries, whatever. But yeah, and then I also did how does neocolonialism influence Latin America today? And I said I think personally it mostly reflects on or influences resource collection and political issues. Mainly like all the gangs and all that. And that's all I have. So